Well, welcome once again to ARTBreak, everyone. Well, relief prints, such as woodcuts, are really the oldest and most elemental form of printmaking. Woodcuts really started back in China in the 5th century, where they were used to decorate or create patterns on fabrics. And as you know, the process involves carving away at a block of wood that, when printed, creates distinct images or areas of light and dark. And one of the characteristics about a woodcut is that it is essentially light and dark, this intense contrast. And it also has these very distinct sort of jagged edges that result from the carving of the block. And I think these basic characteristics of woodcut are some of the reasons why it still attracts artists today. And we're very fortunate today to have one of these artists. Trevor Grabill is a Kalamazoo printmaker who grew up in central Michigan. And as a result, their work draws on not only the natural beauty of the area, but also the disconcerting aspects of sort of rust belt decay and neglect. And this results in what the artist describes as the essential strangeness of the everyday. And they talk about encountering spaces that are both banal and magical, that are often overlooked. In addition to being a practicing artist and the owner and operator of the Flat Mountain Press, Trevor is also a teacher here at the KIA school. And so we're very pleased to have him with us today to discuss their working methods and how printmaking, particularly relief printmaking, inspires their creative imagination. And I think it also gives us an opportunity to see how this very traditional, often sort of humble form of printmaking can create, even in the 21st century, some very striking and dramatic results. So please welcome Trevor Grabill.
Do we turn the lights down a little bit? Is that okay? Cool. That's a great introduction. Thank you. Hard act to follow. So can everyone see that okay? Cool. So as we said, my name is Trevor Grabill. Thanks everyone for being here today. I'm an artist and teacher here at the KIA, and for my talk today, I'm going to be talking through 5 of my pieces. I'm going to use those specific pieces to explain kind of what I make and why I make it. So to start with, just a little bit about me. I grew up between Mount Pleasant and Newaygo, Michigan, and I've spent my life in small towns around the Great Lakes region. The landscape of this part of the world, both physical and spiritual, is an important part of my work and how I see the world. I think that there's something really strange and special about a place that is both so beautiful and so often passed by or flown over. As an artist, I make mostly block prints, as we talked about before, which are more or less hand-carved stamps. This is a small, simple one. The pieces we're going to be looking at today are a bit more complex, but I make a lot of little ones like this as well. I also wanted to mention before we get started how great it is that teaching at the KIA means an opportunity to work in a really wide variety of media. Experimentation and play are a really important part of the creative process, and I'm really grateful that we have the facilities to do that here. Block prints are my main body of work and the work I'll be focusing on today, but I also work in ceramics and sometimes photography. These are a few cups that I made this past spring in a ceramics class with Eve Holtzclaw. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about my process in general, sort of an overarching scheme of how I work. Most of my work begins with drawing in a sketchbook, sometimes from life, sometimes from memory or imagination. Drawing from observation and drawing from imagination can be very different processes that serve different purposes, but in either case, drawing is the basic building block for all of my work. A lot of those drawings, or the ideas for them, come from things seen on long walks or bike rides. Those drawings are then refined, carved, and printed. I'm going to go more deeply into the mechanics of that process up ahead. And I just wanted to touch briefly on one more part of my process as an artist, which is art fairs. In a time when so much of our art experience and socialization in general is highly mediated, I've found that art fairs are a really fun way to engage with people about the work and what they see in it. I first started doing them through economic necessity, but I've come to see them as an essential part of the process. So moving on to the specific pieces. For each of these pieces, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the process of creating them, and then talk about my conceptual intention for each piece. This first piece, Violent Skies, is the oldest piece we'll be looking at today, and also the largest. I made this piece as a part of a steamroller printmaking event at Western Michigan University back in 2019. And here's an image of me with the piece for scale. We'll be delving more into the process of creating each of these pieces, but in brief, this piece, like almost all of the pieces we'll be looking at today, is a relief print. It's essentially an image made from a hand-carved stamp, in this case, carved from wood. As I said before, most of my work starts with a pencil drawing. This is the original drawing for Violent Skies, scanned from my sketchbook. In this case, the original drawing is pretty similar to the final result. For the next step of the process, I'm going to be getting the image onto the wooden block that I'll carve to make the print. This is a particularly large print, so I'm using an overhead projector here to project the drawing onto the wood block, and then tracing the image there with a white pencil. So this is a particularly fun part of the process for me. I really like working kind of in the glow of the overhead projector. It's very nostalgic of like elementary school days. After that, the block is carved. I use gouges to remove everything that will be white in the final print, sort of an inversion of the drawing process. We'll see a close-up video of carving a little later, but for now, you can imagine the gouge as something like a small chisel. So you can see how I'm kind of digging away at the image here and removing everything that I don't want to print. I'm creating a raised surface for the ink to sit on when I roll it out, and that will hold the ink and allow me to print the image on there. So finally, the ink is rolled on the surface of the block, and the paper, or in this case, it's actually fabric, is pressed into it to create the finished print. Usually that pressure is created in one of two ways. Either the print goes through a simple press, kind of like the one in the first photo that we started with, or the back of the paper is burnished with a tool called a baron, and we'll look at that in a little bit. For this piece, however, we used a steamroller. It's part of a steamroller printmaking event, and essentially the steamroller is driven back and forth over the block after the fabric is pressed down into it to create the print. And so this is a short video of just us lifting the print off of the block here. And you can see how that image gets kind of doubled and reversed.
So that's simple plywood?
Yeah, so that's birch plywood. The actual print itself is 40 inches by 60 inches, but it was just a 4x8 sheet of wall plywood, flooring actually, I think it was. I've become a little bit more cautious about what kinds of woods I use, because sometimes depending on what you get. There's a little bit more formaldehyde in the glues that laminate that plywood, so I'm a little bit more intentional about where I get that. But at that point in my career, I was kind of using whatever wood I could find. And as for the carving process, it works great. So that's a very brief overview of the process of creating a print. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the content of this piece. When I drew Violent Skies, I was thinking about the abuse and neglect of refugees all over the world, but particularly at our southern border. This was around the time that kids in cages was a major part of the news cycle, though of course that crisis began long before that and continues today. In some ways, this is a very directly allegorical piece. I pretty rarely work with symbols that correlate very directly to a specific meaning. But in this case, the bird represents what felt like opportunistic cruelty in media depiction, and the eyes at the top are sort of us in a way. They're broader public bearing witness and sort of shedding ineffectual tears, crying, but not a whole lot happening or changing. So this is a detail shot of the figures of the piece, which I'd consider the most important part. I really enjoy working at this scale. When I get to work big like that, I feel like there's a lot of extra room to breathe and move around. I can kind of use my whole body when carving. And in this case, that gave me a chance to play with all the small marks that make up each of the characters. So, you can see when we're up close like this, you can really see sort of a track mark of where all of my cuts with the gouge took place. And I wanted to briefly mention the work of this artist, Keta Kovitz, whose work is a major influence on me and specifically on this body of work that we're talking about right now. Kovitz was a German printmaker most active between the world wars, whose work used figures to explore concepts of grief and social justice. I'm particularly inspired by a couple of aspects of her work. The intense emotion that we see in her faces and hands, and also the way that she can powerfully depict light and shadow with just a few carved marks. So if you look, for example, at the child's face, I have a laser pointer here. I'm going to try this out and see how this works. Oh, that's cool. So if we look at this child's face down here, there's really very few cuts that are making up that face, and yet it reads so strongly emotional, or especially the hands down here. So I was really inspired with that when working on this body of work. So as I mentioned before, I've grouped this talk into 5 different pieces, but for each of these pieces, I want to share a few more works that I consider a part of the same overarching project or body of work. These 3 prints all draw on the same inspirations as Violent Skies. They're titled Blood Embrace, which is this one here, In the Rain, and Hold Tight. All of them are about solidarity, solace, and grief. They're all a little bit older. The latest in this group is from 2020, which is one all the way over on the right. And when contrasted with the next piece, I think it'll be a good illustration of the direction that I'm personally growing in as an artist and what my work is focusing on. So this next one, this is the next larger piece of work and body of work I want to look at. This one is called Let No Fellow Wanderer Be a Stranger, and I made it in the fall of last year. When compared with the previous body of work, I think a few things stand out. I've taken a step back from the individual people and brought them into a landscape, and also, maybe more importantly, color has become a major part of the piece, particularly its emotion and tone. So like before, this piece began with a drawing. This is another pencil drawing in my sketchbook, drawn from life at Sherwood Park in Kalamazoo's Eastwood neighborhood. And this is a digital redrawing of the piece. I knew that I wanted color to be an important part of this work, and also that I wanted to include 2 figures that weren't present in the original drawing. To make this redrawing, I took a photo of the sketchbook drawing and then reworked it on the iPad, which allowed me to plan the different layers that I'll use to make the finished print. So you'll notice that in here, digital drawing allows you to, use as many different colors as you could possibly imagine, but I've focused here on limiting my color palette in a way that I'll be able to reproduce when I work with the print. And this is a video of me carving one of the blocks for this print. You get a better view of what the carving process looks like here. I'm essentially using the blade, this one is shaped like a U, to scoop away the parts of the block that won't be inked. You asked about wood types earlier. This one is carved from Luan plywood. As you can imagine, my studio and my whole house are covered in little wood chips like that. So I wanted to say a few words here about working with wood. Some of my prints are carved in linoleum. For example, that first little red one that we saw that was in the leaves. But most of the time I prefer to work with wood. I love that its patterns record a natural process of growth, and then it kind of has its own opinions about what shape it will take. Essentially, I feel like the wood wants to be one thing and I want it to be another, and we meet in the middle in collaboration. So Let No Follow Wanderer is a multi-block print, which means that there are separate blocks for each color in the finished piece. The blocks are layered on top of each other to create the final multicolored piece. Here we have the first layer, red, isolated on its own. And this next one is for the second layer, a greenish turquoise. And this is what the print looks like with just those first two layers printed on top of each other. You can see that where they overlap, they're creating a third color, a sort of a darker brownish green. I really love this Venn diagram effect, where you get three colors out of two blocks. So you can see this color here is not an individual block that I've carved, but just the overlapping of the two. And then we have our final layer. It's the darkest, and this is the dark blue. And this is the finished print with all three layers. You can see that with 3 layers, 3 passes of printing, we've achieved 5 colors. The red, the turquoise, and the blue of the original inks. The brown, kind of a greenish brown, where the turquoise and the red overlap, and the white of the unprinted paper. Particularly exciting when it's carved in such a way that the white kind of feels like a color on its own as opposed to just an untouched part of the composition. So I get excited about that. So now on to what this piece is about. Like many of us, I spent a lot of early COVID wandering around by myself, oftentimes on deserted streets. It seemed like passing someone on the sidewalk was becoming rarer and rarer. And so this piece, Let No Fellow Wanderer Be a Stranger, is about solidarity between people out for a walk. And that was why when we go back to, I'm going to see if I can navigate back to the original drawing. That was why it felt important to me that I bring some figures into there, and also that cat in the corner. There's also another fellow wanderer that's encountering. But yeah, that was why those felt like they needed to be incorporated there. Let No Fellow Wanderer is part of a project, which I consider my main project as an artist, right now at least, of looking for the strange, magical, or beautiful in things and places we usually just pass by without noticing. The idea is though it can become dull through repetition or overstimulation, our world is very strange in both wonderful and terrible ways. Hopefully, remembering that can shake our sense of inevitability and encourage us to work to keep the things we love and change the things we don't. To share a few more pieces that are also a part of that project, this is Suburban Nights, which is about the beauty and spookiness of being in a strange neighborhood at night. This is a detail shot of that same piece. Hopefully you can see the person sitting in the garage watching. Oh, that does show up on there, cool. This one was inspired by a personal experience of admiring the moon and then noticing that I was being watched from someone's garage. I think we probably all had similar experiences where we just noticed someone there who we've been standing near, but so I was standing there watching the moon and then noticed that someone was watching me. These two pieces, The Long Way Home, which is here. I really like using this laser pointer. The Long Way Home and Learning to Be a Vessel came from meditative experiences biking to and from an old studio surrounded by semi-abandoned industrial buildings. And this last one, called 3 Hours to Home, is about the way that we can fall in love with unassuming places through familiarity. The next bigger piece I want to look at is called When Will You Follow the Swamp Path? This one is a 5-layer print: yellow, light green, red, dark green, and blue. It's also a reduction print, which means that unlike the previous piece, all the colors are carved from the same block. This means that the block disappears as I work. I can never go back and print more of these, which sometimes makes things feel a little bit riskier and more precious. Here's the original pencil drawing for that piece. Like Let No Fellow Wanderer, this one is drawn from life while out on a walk, this time at Kleinstadt Preserve. So this is our first layer, yellow. What I've done is carve away only the parts of the print that will be white in the end, and then print the whole thing in yellow. It's characteristic of reduction prints that the piece doesn't look like much at the beginning. And then I return to that same block and carve away everything that will be yellow in the finished print. What I'm left with is the light green layer of the block. I print that on top of the yellow layer from before. So just to kind of toggle back and forth. This was our first layer. I returned to that same block, carved away everything that I wanted to be yellow. I wound up with this. And when those two are printed on top of each other, this is the green printed on top of the yellow. So we can start to see the image starting to emerge from there. Next, I'm going to return to the same block and carve away the light green parts of the block. This is a video of me carving away the light green. So you can see that I'm going in and just removing everything that will be light green in the finished piece. And what I'm left with is the red layer, which looks like this. And when we print our first 3 layers sequentially, we get yellow, light green, and red. And you can see as you work that, particularly with this reduction method, you start to have this image kind of sort of like jump out from the void. It starts to grow into something, which is a really fun process to get to work with. Next, I carve away the red, which leaves me with the dark green. And finally remove the dark green layer, leaving me with the dark blue. This is me printing the final layer of the print. The tool I'm using here is called a baron. I mentioned that before. Traditionally, these are made of bamboo, but this one is made with glass. So it's a blown glass baron. And then this is our final result. As I mentioned before, the block disappears as you work, so reduction prints are limited. I started by printing 12 copies of the yellow layer, and that's all there can ever be of this one. I can't go back and get that yellow layer again. Reduction prints take a little bit more planning at the beginning, which can be very stressful for folks. I find it pretty fun. I think of it as kind of a fun visual algebra. So When Will You Follow the Swamp Path came from a time spent at Kleinstock on a fall day, and it's a pretty simple piece. I was captivated by how beautiful the view was, and I felt the need to record a little bit of that magic. As an overarching project, these pieces that I'm sharing are pretty similar to the previous group. They're all about seeing and celebrating details, perhaps in a less emotionally complicated way than the pieces about neighborhoods and forgotten spaces. This one, Mosaic, is a view from biking on Ravine Road on a sunny fall day. This one is also a 5-layer reduction. Here I started with the sky blue and then continued on to the green and then the yellow, the golden yellow or orange, and then finally ended with the red. And this is Redwing in the sumac and chaotic growth. Redwing is a multi-block print that was inspired by seeing one of my favorite birds come back in the spring, and chaotic growth is a 3-layer reduction of a very tiny plant growing in the dunes. So when I compare this body of work that we're talking about now with the previous one, neighborhoods, forgotten spaces, trying to notice beauty that's easily passed by, I also want to let myself as an artist appreciate beauty that is kind of obviously beautiful. Things like birds that I think everybody loves, most people love, I hope. So these are, a little bit simpler in that way, but still about noticing beauty and being intentional and present with it. So next I'd like to talk about this piece, You Are a Traveler. This piece represents a little bit of a departure for me. Each of these images is an original carved block, not a print. One of the most common questions I'm asked at art fairs and in general is whether I display printing blocks. The answer generally is no. They tend to be an inky mess, and I also usually want to use them to make more prints. But it was an intriguing idea, so I spent some time thinking about when and where a block might work well as a finished piece. You Are a Traveler was conceived as a part of Art Path in Lansing, a series of public art pieces, installations, murals, and sculptures along the river trail. It's composed of 12 1-foot by 1-foot cedar blocks with a carved image and text. To darken the block before carving, instead of using ink, I used a walnut stain. And the pieces were finally installed on the railing of this boardwalk overlooking the Grand River in Lansing. Part of the idea with these is, I guess it's kind of a poem. I don't think of myself as a poet at all, but the idea was that they would be read sequentially as you walked along the river, but I tried to structure them in a way that if you read it backwards, it would work as well. So as a finished piece, it's meant to be experienced while moving through that specific space. Obviously, we can't all go do that today. So this is just a video of me walking along the piece and reading the inscriptions.
You are between sky and ground, land and water, past and future. You are a traveler on a strange road among people, among plants, among animals, among friends. Look closely and breathe deep.
Loud, sorry. So as you can see, it's a really beautiful spot. I was kind of captivated by how beautiful the river is there, and it's not, a particularly scenic part of this park. There's industrial buildings all around. There's a restaurant right behind me. And yet, because we were there on the river, it was a very contemplative place. So what I wanted to think about with this piece is the way that we're sort of always living between worlds. A park is a gray area between nature and human development, a place for both solitude and public experience. A riverbank is a thin line between the water and the land, and a footpath is a rare opportunity to move slowly through the world, giving us a chance to occupy that in-between space with intention and patience. My hope was that You Are a Traveler would be an invitation to meditation and contemplation within that strange in-between place. So this kind of represents a direction that I'd like to grow with my work. I liked working with these carved blocks that aren't necessarily prints. It's kind of a fusion between the techniques that I'm most used to and also doing some things I'm uncomfortable with as an artist. For example, when you get to make prints, there's a lot of work in the carving and the printing process, but then I wind up with 10, 15, 20 copies, or I could make infinite copies from any of these blocks. And in this case, I got just one of each of them. And so that felt like an uncomfortable but pretty artistically fruitful space to live in, and think about, how do I share something that doesn't have a lot of copies? How do I get this? How do I make this available to people? And I think that public art is a pretty interesting way to do that. The last piece I'd like to discuss is The Good Neighbor. It's the most recent piece that we're looking at today. I actually just finished it last Monday. This print was developed as part of a residency that I'm participating in at MSU's Kellogg Biological Station in Hickory Corners on Gull Lake. It's a 3-layer multi-block woodcut, similar to the second piece we looked at, Let No Fellow Wanderer Be a Stranger. So as a brief warning, the next photo we're going to look at shows a pinned moth in an insect collection. So if you don't like moths, close your eyes. This next piece started with this moth that I saw in a researcher's collection. And so I took a photo of the moth and then later made a few drawings of it. The plants at the bottom of this drawing represent a couple of native wildflowers. These guys, kind of balloony ones, are milkweed plants without the milkweed flowers. And then the tall ones here are yarrow, and then there's also stylized grasses in there. So what I'm thinking about with this is the landscape of the oak savanna and the prairie, kind of our native landscape around here. And this is the digital color plan that I've made from the previous drawing. Like the one that I showed for Let No Fellow Wanderer, I've separated the colors according to the layers of ink that I want to use for the final print. Here I'm enlarging the drawing on the block using the overhead projector and then carving one of the blocks at a picnic table in my backyard. So at this point, these steps in the process are probably pretty familiar to y'all, but this is just like what I was doing when I was working on that first piece, Violent Skies. I just make a transparency and project that onto the block and draw from there. Usually it slips and falls a few times when I'm trying to draw it, but it works out. And back to our finished 3-layer piece. So we have light purple, orange, and dark purple. The project of this residency is to have conversations with researchers about their work, and then make pieces that explore the concepts of their research. My goal was to consider the central questions that they were getting at, and then try to express the narrative of that question in a poetic or spiritual way, which I will say is a pretty funny thing to do with scientists, to try to not get sort of to look at what the central question is. I expected it to be more difficult than it was. I feel like what I found was that the researchers there had a pretty poetic relationship with their work. So The Good Neighbor came out of a talk with an entomologist whose work dealt with complex webs of connections between organisms. I wanted to make a piece that explored that interdependence along with the beauty of a long, hot summer night. So to touch on that residency just a little bit, this is the little drawing table I set up for myself in the cottage I was staying at. On the far side of that parking lot is Gull Lake. And this is my temporary folding table print workshop. I made this print of a yarrow flower I encountered in one of the research fields there. The main body of research I was engaging with was called the Long-Term Ecological Research Project, which studies ecological interactions in our landscape over the course of many decades, including the impact of native wildflower plots on agriculture. This is a photo of the LTER fields, not my photo. One of the questions that arose most frequently during this residency, both with the researchers and in my own, was about the intersection of art and science practices. So as I mentioned earlier, I felt like it was going to be kind of a funny question to ask scientists to get at the central spiritual question that they were working towards. But I really found that that was something that they were deeply engaged with already. I'd never thought of the two practices as being very similar, but I noticed that in each conversation that curiosity, observation, and fascination seemed to be at the core of field research. And all of those things are things that I'd considered to be central to the work of being an artist as well. So for these last images, these are going to be some works in progress from this residency. Each one is a pencil drawing that I made during the residency, as well as the digital color plan for what will become a print. This one's pretty simple. It's a milkweed plant that was also in the LTER fields. This one is called Microcosmic Soil Dimension. It came out of a conversation with a soil microbiologist about the ramifications of climate change on soil microbiomes. Fast fact that I learned, 59% of life on Earth lives in the soil. And so I was moved by the idea of worlds within worlds and sort of invisible communities deeply impacting us but being unconsidered. And so this drawing was the result. And this last one is another piece from the LTER research fields. These structures, sort of like tiny geodesic greenhouses, are designed to simulate the effects of climate change on native plants. You might recognize them from the photo a few slides back. Actually, I'll just pop back to that because I think they're really cool. So you can see those structures there. This is going to be a 5-layer print. You can see the yellow here and this magenta color. They're going to overlap to create that orange. We'll have a blue that will overlap with the yellow to create this green, and then a secondary blue that will create the slightly darker green. And then finally, I'm going to do a purple layer, a light purple layer for all of these outlines around the plants. So back to what this print is about. Basically, these are really utilitarian objects that are made to explore the ramifications of something quite dark and scary, the ramifications of climate change on native plants, but their shape and the life wildly flourishing within, I think, is really beautiful. So that's the end of my images for today. Thank you so much for being here. Does anyone have any questions?
In Lansing, are those, is it still there?
Yeah, so it is, the project, the Art Path project is finished, but I haven't picked those up yet. They are going to be deinstalled sometime in October, mid-October. So they're still there. They're by, if you know where Lansing Shuffle is, it's right on the Grand River on the Art Path. So it's, yep. And there are a lot of murals down there that are also part of the same project. So if you're interested in, you know, an art day in Lansing, just following the river trail there, there's a lot of public artwork there to see. Yeah. Any other questions?
That was fabulous, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And the Japanese are those separate blocks that those Japanese artists use?
Yeah, traditionally. That's not my field of expertise necessarily, but traditionally, yeah, it's a multi-block print and they use a water-based ink, so that you get those kind of translucent effects that are going on with that. Yeah.
So when you showed that first video of carving that big,
Uh-huh.
I told Tony, I said, I get screwed up and carve someplace I wasn't supposed to. Does that happen, and can you like putty that back in?
That is maybe the most common question that comes up in class. Short answer is no. You can do it. There are ways to fix it. It's never going to look like the rest of the board. So you're going to be able to see where you fixed it. And you also can't, if you make a mistake and fix it, you can't go back in and carve it anymore very well. They make products that are specifically designed to do that. And I don't think they work very well. I've also seen people use just like a wood filler or even caulk to fill stuff in, and it certainly it works to a certain extent. But I think that one of the things that I love about working in this medium is sort of the meditative process of you make a mistake, you roll with it, you incorporate it, rather than try to make things right. And I'm not going to go back through my slides to look for examples, but if you did, you would find lots of examples of spots where I cut where I did not want to cut, and I've just either incorporated it or there's just a little bit of a slip in there, and it's just part of the image. So.
Did you do all the pieces that went along that water?
Mhm.
The different pieces?
Sure. You Are a Traveler, that one? Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I'm no artist and I don't know anything about, obviously, I really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to work with. And like I said, it'll be up for another couple weeks, I think. So, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about scale, like how you choose the scale for the pieces?
Sure.
Really, because you're working with drawings, so you really get to choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is sort of it almost feels like working on working digitally, where I get to just like drag and drop and decide how big this piece is going to be. So like I mentioned at the beginning, scale partly is influenced by how much space I want to have to make marks. So this is a particularly big piece here. And you can see all these little guys in here are really big gouge marks that I made very, I don't know if casually is the word I want to use, made very quickly and kind of gesturally. And I don't think that I'd be able to have that same effect if I was working tiny. I think that the marks that you get when you're carving like with your arms and your shoulders can feel a lot more like embodied than marks that you make when you're working with your hands and your fingers. So that's one reason that I like to work large. I think that small work is really beautiful too, and it's really precious, and it's nice to be able to hold prints in your hand. So for me, the biggest thing in that determination of whether I want to blow a print up a lot or if I want to leave it the size of the drawing or even sometimes shrink it down is kind of what kind of a statement is it making. So if it's something that I would want to sit down with a friend and share in a quiet voice, or read in a book or something like that, I feel like that becomes a small print. And if it's something that we like laugh about together at a party or like something that we want to be loud about together, that becomes a large print. So it's a big part of scale for me. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank
Cool. Yeah. Any other questions?
What are some ways that you think local institutions could better support emerging and working artists like yourself?
It's a great question. I'm gonna, what's that?
More money.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about like kind of the responsibilities of arts organizations. There are arts organizations, and I don't feel like this is particularly the case locally, but I see broadly a lot of arts organizations that seem like they kind of exist to raise funds through applications and through application fees and things like that. So I guess I see an arts organization when their mission is to support artists, their job is to, like you said, more money, to kind of do the legwork to organize funding so that they don't end up using artists as an opportunity to create funding for themselves. Certainly their continued existence is a priority. I don't expect like arts organizations to throw themselves under the bus on that one, but I guess I would consider it sort of their job to be looking for ways to create opportunities for artists that don't necessarily need those artists to bring money to the table to start them.
I think Kalamazoo does a very good job of doing that.
I would agree with that.
The generosity in general of the society is remarkable, and of several different singular individuals is spectacular. And they do it here.
Mhm.
They could do it in Chicago.
It's very
They
true.
could do it in New York. They do it here. And I'm sure that you feel the generosity coming through you.
Yeah, I definitely. I talk a lot. When I do these art fairs in other cities. I talk a lot with folks about how I found Kalamazoo to be kind of strangely supportive of artists for a city of this size. That I know a lot of artists who are making work really actively, and I know many artist friends who are really struggling to do that in larger cities. That doesn't mean that isn't happening here, but that's a big question, what organizations can do more of, and maybe one that I would need to think more about. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.